Over the past several weeks, I'm sure many of you have heard expressions of despair over the Israel-Palestine conflict. Phrases such as, it's just so complicated, or this is a centuries-old conflict between Jews and Muslims. I reject both of these statements. The origins of this struggle lie in the early 20th century, and the conflict is simple to understand. On one side are the indigenous people of the region, forcefully expelled from their land and living under the occupation of the other side. A brutal colonial project founded on an act of mass ethnic cleansing that continues to this day. This story begins in 1896 when Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian Jewish journalist, published a pamphlet laying out his political ideology known as Zionism. Herzl's experiences of anti-Semitism had left him in despair that Jewish people would ever be accepted in European society. Instead, he called for the establishment of a Jewish state in either Palestine or Argentina. Herzl was explicit that this would be a colonial project, requiring the displacement of natives by force. And so he argued for obtaining an official legal sanction for the colonization efforts. Although the majority of European Jews considered Zionism a distasteful fringe movement, its followers would lobby various governments in Europe for sanction of the Zionist project until they finally had success with Britain. On November 2nd, 1917, Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, issued a letter announcing that the British government viewed with great favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. The letter, known as the Balfour Declaration, was problematic for a number of reasons. Chiefly, that just over a year ago, in June 1916, the people of the Arabian Peninsula had risen up in revolt against the Ottoman Turks in return for Britain's promise of independence over their lands. In the course of World War I, the Arabs defeated the Ottomans, but their dream of independence would go unfulfilled. Britain and France had already settled on a secret treaty, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that would divide the Arab lands between the two empires. Britain, which had long held the ambition of colonizing Palestine, received a mandate from the League of Nations to govern that territory. So, having fought to free themselves from the oppression of one empire, the Palestinians found themselves under the rule of another. With Britain in control of Palestine, the Zionist project was greenlit. European Zionists began immigrating to the region and building settlements. The Zionist push to acquire land by any means, including forcing Palestinians out of their villages, led to the British placing restrictions on Jewish immigration and land purchases. Just as colonial Americans raged against British restrictions on westward expansion, the Zionists would rebel against the British to continue their colonial project. In the 1940s, the horrors of the Holocaust led to a surge of Jewish immigrants to Palestine and gradually allowed Zionism to enter the mainstream of public opinion. Due to international sympathy for the Jewish people's suffering, the Zionist project was greeted with great fanfare by liberals in Europe and America. And this brings us to the War of 1948. On November 29th, 1947, the United Nations adopted a plan to partition Palestine into Jewish and Palestinian territories, with 56% of the land going to Jewish settlers who were only 33% of the population. Civil war erupted in Palestine following this news, as Jewish and Palestinian militias fought bitterly over control of the land. While the Palestinians were supported by the surrounding Arab states, the Zionists had grown a formidable army with British support. On May 14th, 1948, the British terminated their mandate over Palestine. And the next day, the Jewish leadership declared the establishment of the State of Israel. And this leads us to the Nakba. While the War of 1948 is remembered in Israel as their War of Independence, it is remembered by the Palestinians under a different name, the Nakba, meaning disaster or catastrophe. The Nakba refers to the forced displacement of 700,000 Palestinians by exceptionally brutal means during the 1948 war. A month before Israel's declaration of statehood, the village of Deir Yassin was stormed by Israeli settler militia. Reports describe incidents of mass rape that scores of men, women, and children were stripped, photographed, and slaughtered with machine guns. 200 people were murdered. In July, in Lydda, civilians were indiscriminately shot even as they fled. Grenades were thrown through the windows of homes. Between 250 and 500 people were murdered. As discovered by Israeli historians within Israel's military records, and from the testimony of Palestinian survivors, and also from the video testimony of Israeli veterans of these acts. These same atrocities were committed in 500 towns and villages throughout the region. After clearing the inhabitants, the Israeli militias razed the buildings to the ground, and in some cases contaminated the well water with typhoid so that none might return. These acts were so outrageous that the United Nations issued a resolution ordering Israel to allow all displaced Palestinians to return to their homes. Israel has conveniently ignored this resolution with the excuse that the Palestinians chose to leave. To this day, Israel insists that the Nakba never happened and has sought to eradicate any public references to it. In 2009, the Israeli Education Ministry banned the use of the word Nakba in textbooks for Palestinian children. Before 1948, Palestinians owned 90% of the land. 4 years later, they owned 3%. And today, tens of thousands of them remain in refugee camps. Now, Britain had washed their hands of controlling this project. But in 1956, America was so impressed by Israel's invasion of Egypt to topple President Gamal Nasser, who had nationalized the Suez Canal Company, that the US became Israel's new financial and military benefactor. For America, Israel would be a military foothold in the region and a powerful tool for suppressing any further nationalist movements. In 1967, with the strength of American weapons, Israel launched a surprise attack against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and invaded the Palestinian territories, which had been occupied by those respective countries. This was known as the Six-Day War, and the Palestinians have lived under Israeli occupation ever since. During this war, Israel showered the land with napalm and firebombs, killing 40,000 people, many of them civilians trapped in crowded cities. Under 800 Israeli soldiers and only 20 Israeli civilians were killed in this conflict. The occupation of Palestine. After Israel captured and occupied the West Bank and Gaza Strip, it took control of local governments and began to establish Israeli settlements. Home demolitions and expulsion are still commonly used against the Palestinians as Israeli settlements grow ever larger around their cities. Under occupation, the Palestinians have no rights, no citizenship, and no prospect of independence. They cannot vote in Israeli elections and live under a system of apartheid. In Gaza, there are streets that Palestinians are not allowed to walk upon, streets that were once their bustling market streets. Numerous restrictions on what materials can enter the territory make it extremely difficult to build necessary infrastructure and rebuild what is destroyed by Israeli bombs. The medical infrastructure is limited in its capabilities. The Palestinians requiring complex surgeries and cancer treatments must apply for permission to travel for that care, which is frequently denied. Since Israel bombed the wells in Gaza, 80% of the water there is unfit for human consumption. People of Gaza are literally trapped within its walls. They are forbidden to enter either Israel or Egypt, having been branded as potential terrorists, making Gaza the world's largest concentration camp. In the West Bank, it is divided into 165 disconnected cantons, cut off by military checkpoints, walls, and settlements. In Ramallah, the Palestinians were forbidden from building a sewage plant, while their water sources used for agriculture were repeatedly contaminated by Israeli settlers. Palestinians with Israeli citizenship are under an ID system that determines where you can live, where you can work. They cannot pass their ID status to their spouses. And because of these difficulties, many of them choose to live abroad. During this period, the West Bank formed the Palestinian Authority as a form of limited self-governance, while Gaza elected the militant group Hamas to run its local government in 2006. The PA works with Israel and suppresses resistance movements, while Hamas is dedicated to armed struggle against Israel. Limited by the resources available within Gaza, Hamas strikes at Israel with low-power rockets without any guidance systems. The Iron Dome is more than enough to deter most of these rockets, but Israel still retaliates with bombing campaigns that kill thousands of civilians. Despite having laser-guided missiles and claiming that they only target Hamas bases, Israel still manages to strike residential buildings, schools, hospitals, refugee camps, and even convoys of vehicles fleeing down a safety corridor that Israel had designated for them to escape the bombing campaign from. In the current war, that same thing exactly happened. Israel told Palestinians to evacuate northern Gaza to the south and then bomb the convoys on roads they announced as safety corridors. They advised Palestinians to escape to Egypt through the border crossing at Rafah, and then bombed the crossing 4 times. So how should we describe Israel? I would say that Israel is a settler colonial project that satisfied Britain and America's desire to colonize Palestine. The solution of Israel effectively outsourced the labor of colonization to Jewish people, who would carry out the dangerous work of forcing Palestinians off the land and fighting their resistance. From the very beginning, Israel has been a project of ethnic cleansing, leaving the Palestinians in a struggle for their very existence. Over the years, Palestinians have largely exhausted all peaceful options to resolve the conflict, such as the Great March of Return in Gaza, where Palestinians approached the wall of the Israeli border to demand their right of return to the lands where they were displaced from. And this was met with gunfire and created an entire generation of amputees in Gaza because Israeli snipers would target their knees. When the Palestinian Authority made gains in reaching a 2-state solution, the Israeli government then secretly funded Hamas to create a militant counterweight to the PA that opposed 2-statism. Which is not to say that we support 2-statism, but just to show that Israel has no interest in it either. Israel has recently elected one of the most far-right governments in its history, with high-ranking members openly describing themselves as fascists and calling for the total annexation of all Palestinian lands. In other words, to finish the Nakba. Israeli settlers have continued their push to claim more Palestinian lands, not just by expelling residents, but through sabotage and terrorism. The settlers are allowed to carry guns, and the Israeli security forces only have a mandate to protect the settlers, none to protect Palestinians. The result is that the settlers have free rein to harass, assault, and murder Palestinians with zero legal consequences. With mandatory military service for both men and women, Israel forces its youth to participate in its crimes so that no one's hands are clean. In one of history's greatest ironies, young Jews are compelled to play the role of the Nazi, exposing them not only to the immediate danger of military service, but to the everlasting danger of retribution. Israel has long used its Jewish identity as a shield against criticism, but it is not the Palestinians' fault that the people oppressing them happen to be Jewish. And Israel does more to place Jewish people in harm's way than any other regime on the planet. Israel is, at the end of the day, a product of British and American imperialism, a strategic base within the Middle East from which the great powers can exert influence on the region. Israel's proximity to the Suez Canal makes it a prime location for protecting and controlling that trade route. In addition, the land and the people of the region can be exploited for profit. So taking a stand against Israel means rejecting the imperialist strategy of the United States, which the Democrats have wholeheartedly embraced. to say nothing of the Republicans. Where does this leave those of us who support Palestinian liberation? If the ruling class is dedicated to propping up Israel despite its atrocities, if no electoral route exists to rectify the situation, how can we oppose Israel and bring about Palestinian liberation without revolution? The sad reality is that Israel is likely to persist as long as the capitalist system remains in power. Under capitalism, market competition spills over into international competition for strategic and resource-laden regions of the world. Even if the United States hold its support for Israel, there are plenty of imperial competitors who could become Israel's new benefactor. Only through radical struggle can we ever bring an end to this apartheid regime. Only through the destruction of the capitalist system will Palestine ever be free from the river to the sea.